views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the hosts and guests, and not necessarily those of the staff and management of WWDB-TV.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Hey everybody, welcome back to WTF America. This is show number 3, I think, right?
Yep.
And you missed us last week. You were, what, in jail? Oh, no, that was the other guy. Never mind. So you had some family issues to take care of and got him taken care of. And good man, I'm proud of you. So we really don't know what the hell's going to happen from week to week or what we're going to get into.
But it's going to be gross.
It's going to be great. We're gonna make WTF America great again.
Let's meet in the middle somewhere.
A little bit of both.
And we have a guest today, and it's Jason Weinman. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, and you are were the political director for the Libertarian Party of Nevada.
Correct.
Okay, what exactly does the political director for the Libertarian Party of Nevada do? And if you don't mind, let me move this over here a little bit there.
Sure. So ordinarily, a political director of a political party works on setting the party's agenda, coming up with divisions under them, like the legislative division, who are going to work with the legislators during the session in Carson, coming up with a platform and a policy, and then working on the political side with drafting candidates and coming up with campaign strategy and things like that. With the Libertarian Party, it's a little bit broader, just because we're so small. So a little bit of everything in that capacity. Working a little bit with messaging and social media, regular media, that kind of thing.
Okay, cool. Well, before we get too far into this,
Wait, did you know that Nevada is now the first state to have 56% of our legislators
Yeah, I saw
women?
that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'll
I'm
take-
telling you, this is my honest to God, from the heart feeling. All right? They sure as hell couldn't do any better than we've done in the last couple hundred years.
Worse.
Or worse, I mean. I'm sorry. Yeah. No,
That's really
seriously,
rude.
It just makes sense. I mean, that we're going in that direction, because we got to do something, man. So.
All right.
And this is a good example of why we got to do something, because this is, I got this, someone posted this.
I think Alabama, Ohio, Oklahoma, Arkansas, I think they're a better example of why we.
Well, that's
need
true.
that direction.
But this talks to that.
Okay.
I mean, because really, the intelligence level of people astounds me sometime. And so this was posted on my Facebook page this morning, and I'm usually pretty cool about that stuff. I like to think that I let everybody have their own opinion, unless you're talking about some really serious shit, like we'll get into that later. But anyway, so this was posted on my Facebook page this morning. I'm going to read this. I'm going to try to read it fast so we can get through this and get to some important stuff. But this came with a picture, and it's "How I Feel About Trump" by Steve Harvey, and a picture of Steve Harvey there. You know how the memes are. And it just kind of freaked me out a little bit. So this is supposedly what Steve Harvey said. You've been on vacation for 2 weeks. You come home and your basement is infested with raccoons. Hundreds of rabid, messy, mean raccoons have overtaken your basement. You want them gone immediately. You call the city and 4 different exterminators, but nobody can handle the job. But there is one guy, and he guarantees to get rid of them, so you hire him. You don't care if the guy swears. You don't care how many times he's been married. You don't care if he has a plumber's crack. You simply want those raccoons gone. You want your problem fixed. He's the guy. He's the best. Here's why we want Trump. Yes, he's a bit of a jerk. Yes, he's an egomaniac, but we don't care. The country is a mess because politicians suck. The Republicans and Democrats can be two-faced and gutless, and illegals are everywhere. We want it all fixed. We don't care that Trump is crude. We don't care that he insults people. We don't care that he's been married 3 times. We don't care that he fights with Megyn Kelly and Rosie O'Donnell. We don't care that he doesn't know the name of some Muslim terrorist. This country became weak and bankrupt. Our enemies were making fun of us. We are being invaded by illegals. We are becoming a nation of victims where every Tom, Ricardo, and Hasid is a special group with special rights to a point where we don't even recognize the country we were born and raised in, and we just want it fixed. And Trump is the only guy who seems to understand what the people want. We're sick of politicians, sick of the Democratic Party, sick of the Republican Party, and sick of illegals. We just want things fixed. Trump may not be a saint, but we didn't vote for a pope. We voted for a man who doesn't have lobbyist money holding him back, a man who doesn't have political correctness restraining him. We all know that he has been very successful. And, yeah, we all know he's been very successful. He's a good negotiator. He has built a lot of things. He's also not a politician, not a cowardly politician, and he says he'll fix it. And we believe him because he is too much of an egotist to be proven wrong or looked at and called a liar. Also, we don't care if the guy has bad hair. Now we just want those raccoons gone out of our house. So this really pissed me off because of all the dog whistling bullshit that I hear and see every day. I mean, come on. So I just want to make a couple of points. One is what a great businessman Donald Trump is. So these are a few of the failed businesses that Trump has had over the years. We have Trump Airlines, Trump Beverages, Trump the Game, Trump Casinos, Trump Magazine, Trump Mortgage, Trump Steaks, Trump Travel Site, Trump's Com Company, Trump Tower Tampa, Trump University, and Trump Vodka. Those all went bankrupt. They failed. Now, when we're talking about raccoons in the basement, we all know what the fuck they're talking about, right? They're talking about people of color. They're talking about illegal aliens. They're talking about anybody that doesn't look like me. That's bullshit. And if you support that, then I don't want any part of it. And I'm sorry, but that just really got to me today.
I think you should add, though, that did not come from Steve Harvey.
I'm sorry.
As
Thank you,
much
thank you,
as
thank you.
I really
When
don't care for Steve Harvey,
Go ahead.
There's 2 points I want to make
also
about that.
don't
Please do.
think that Steve Harvey, as a black man,
Right.
would make some rant about
Well, what's funny about it
raccoons.
is that Steve Harvey doesn't talk or write or think like that.
Right.
That's the first part
Yeah,
that I
and
found funny.
That's what freaked me out.
But the part that really got me, as soon as I heard him say raccoons, I go,
Yeah, nope.
Steve Harvey doesn't know what the
No.
fuck a raccoon is. He might talk about roaches.
Oh, no.
He might talk about rats. But fucking raccoon, I mean, really?
Right.
Come on.
And here's the thing about raccoons, because I did some research on that too. Raccoons are really very beneficial to our environment. They eat garbage. They eat insects and pests and stuff like that. So if you've got those kinds of things or weeds around your house, raccoons will eat those.
I'm not
So
sure
they-
this is really helping your point.
We've
in-
said the
in
word
comparing-
raccoon
No, what I'm saying is
too
there
many
are-
times for a political show that I'm comfortable being on.
Anyway, so what I'm saying is they do serve a purpose.
Right.
And if that's what you want to call them. But anyway, yeah, so I felt the same way, that there's no fucking way that Steve Harvey
Oh,
would have
no.
said some shit like that.
This
Much like
story
Mexicans.
goes sideways.
went to Snopes, and I found out that no, in fact, Steve Harvey never said anything like this, had never written anything like this. It was not Steve Harvey. And I posted a response to this that if you guys want to talk about fake news bullshit, then check your sources before you post something like this. You know, at least check and see. And so her response was, well, okay, if he didn't write it, take his name off and put my name on. And that was just like, that's not the point. Anyway, I'm done with that. So thank you very much for letting me have my time.
At least he was honest about it.
At the end.
It just,
I had to I had to respond to it. So it's just, they don't care. They don't care as long as we get rid of what they don't like. And that's what it comes down to. Trump supporters just want him to get rid of what they don't like.
And I mean, I think for the most part, it doesn't even matter really what he said or how he said it. You put his name at the end of something, and people who like him are going to
Sure,
like it. And
sure.
it doesn't matter. And people do this all the time.
Right.
Just to test you. They'll put Trump at the end, see
Okay.
what you say.
And the funny thing about it is that if you just actually listen to the diction and the grammar and whatever it is that he claimed that he said, it wasn't him that said it.
Yeah.
And you know he didn't
Yeah.
write
And
it.
you know he didn't
Steve
write it,
Harvey
yeah.
is probably not
have
a literate
challenge.
man.
I have a challenge that I would like to pose to our audience or anybody who's listening or watching this. If you can send us a clip, just one clip, of Donald Trump saying a complete sentence, I would really like to see that. Because it has, I have never seen or heard this guy
That's not fair.
complete a
because
sentence.
That's not fair because you can actually say yes or no, and that's a complete sentence.
Well, that's true. Okay, but it has to be longer than 4 words. Okay?
Okay, now it's challenging. Now you put it
There
out
you
of
go.
challenge. Okay.
Has to have a noun, has to have a verb.
Yeah, I mean, they don't care about any of that, though.
Right.
And that's
Right, like-
just it. They don't care.
Yeah, they don't, none of them believe that there's a single area of policy where Donald Trump has any particular literacy, right?
Right.
They don't care. It's
Yeah.
not what they're about.
They just want to.
Literacy, knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
They
Like
just
he said,
want
he
to
loves the
create a
uneducated.
right-wing theocracy in this country. They talk about freedom of religion, but it's only freedom of their religion. And I don't know if any of you have seen I'm not advocating any religious group, but there is, it's either Michigan or Missouri or Montana, one of those states, the Church of Satan got them to, they passed a law about
Right.
saying prayers in church or in school or something like that. So the Church of Satanism basically challenged the law, and if you are going to say a Christian prayer in church, you also have to allow a satanic prayer. So, well, dude, that's freedom of religion. That's what you wanted, right? So, anyway, sorry. So we have a guest here. I'm sorry for wasting all of your time so
no,
far.
not
I think that one of the things we want to talk about is the Libertarian Party. I don't know why.
Or the Church of Satan. You take a pick.
Well, I'm a fan of both organizations. Yeah, so...
But wait. Does that mean that you're a Satanist and you hate Jesus?
No.
Jason Weinman might be Jewish, but who's to say?
Right.
I wasn't going to go there.
Yeah.
I don't
There are
want
some
I don't want to
skeptics.
get accused of raccooning
Hey,
people.
hey. I want to hear Jason.
Sorry, man.
So, so the Libertarian Party has been around since 1971. We were founded basically as an anti-war party during the Vietnam War by returning veterans who thought that we shouldn't be in Vietnam, and also that maybe putting the government in charge of all of these different areas of our lives was not such a great thing. Typically, a shorthand way, that's not always accurate, but a shorthand way of thinking about libertarianism as an ideology is that it's socially left and fiscally right. And that's been less and less true as the social left in this country has been moving more towards, I would say, away from social liberalism, and the fiscal right in this country has been moving away from what you might call fiscal liberalism, towards
Conservatism?
Right, towards authoritarianism. I don't know if I would refer to, market liberalism or free markets as conservative. I don't think they ever really have been, and because they've had that reputation, it's kind of created a problem for, for free market advocates in throughout our history, really, certainly recently.
Okay.
I mean, in the 90s, and maybe it was a reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism, really. But you saw a big push for free trade and market liberalization, even government spending caps, and that all came from a bipartisan movement. Starting with Bill Clinton, and of course, a split Congress, and then a Republican Congress, and they've moved progressively further and further away from that. So, we see now the government controlling more and more sectors of our economy. The Republicans coming after free trade as, really one of their two, I think, core issues these days. And even the Democrats, to a certain extent, and hopefully I think we see more of this, moving towards free trade and adopting some of the free trade principles. But at least in the broadest sense, I think socially left and fiscally right will give you some idea of what libertarianism is about.
Okay, so if I'm not sure how to ask this, less government is kind of one of the.
Yeah.
You want to see a reduced level of government interference in our daily lives.
Absolutely.
Okay. Does that include things like the EPA?
It does. So if you want to talk about what makes something libertarian, reducing the amount of government involved is what makes it libertarian. Doesn't mean libertarians think we should do that in every case.
Yeah, no, that's why I'm
Right.
asking.
But-
I just picked that as an example.
Well, so obviously different libertarians are going to have different ideas about where we should be
as
focusing.
different Democrats
But
and
in the
different
case
Republicans,
in the
right?
case, I think of the EPA or environmental regulations, I think a lot of libertarians, certainly any libertarian that I would support, thinks that those are important issues, right? Thinks that focusing on environment, on ecological protection and environmental conservation is a good thing to do. But like in other areas of regulation and government involvement, they do more harm than good, right? They create more problems, even if their intentions are good, which at least most of the time they at least partly are. Their plans still tend to backfire, right? So I'll give you an example. And I forget exactly what year it is, 2011, I think, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
Right.
A lot of people think that was a failure of markets, and that we need more government oversight, more regulations to tell our businesses how to operate so that this doesn't happen. But in fact, government regulation is the reason BP wasn't responsible for that spill, right? In fact, instead of having a system where the government says this is how you're supposed to do it, and then we're going to come inspect you and maybe give you a little fine if it doesn't go well, maybe you should be responsible for your own actions, right? Maybe if BP does a certain amount of damage, then they should be responsible to pay that certain amount of damages, right? So just by, for instance, privatizing land and industry and commerce, we have a better system through torts of addressing the problems.
So
that
so
come
the
with-
industry should be self-policing.
Well, I do think we need a court system and a system of recourse for private individuals or organizations who are negatively affected, right? Externalities are a real thing. It's not necessarily true that there would have been no oil spill if not for the EPA, although I think it's very likely there would have been no oil spill or that it would have been smaller.
How did the EPA cause the oil spill?
Because they're creating a moral hazard, right? As long as you're compliant.
Define that.
Moral hazard is where the incentives are changed by the involvement of a third party, which in this case is government, right? And particularly where the incentives are changed in a bad way. So as long as you are in compliance with EPA mandates or regulations, you're not responsible for damages, right? And how could you be? Everything you did was legal, right? So instead of that system, I think we should have a system, where we have torts and we have a court system, legal system, where if people are harmed or if there are damages from somebody's actions, they can take that party to court and sue for the dollar value of damages, or the dollar value plus potentially some punitive amount to prevent it from happening in the future, right?
So there's more incentive to be even more careful and
Right. Well, not only more incentive, but it's also possible, although it's not what happened in the case of the BP oil spill, it's also possible for a regulatory agency to go too far in the other direction, right? For instance, to ban offshore drilling entirely, right? And if they did ban offshore drilling, you wouldn't see oil spills like Deepwater Horizon. What you would see instead is that we don't have access to that resource, and the costs would be much, much greater than they are to the harms that we see from externalities.
The cost would be greater for the petroleum industry
No,
and
overall.
petroleum products.
For the consumer.
Yeah. So you want to consider everybody's.
And define that just a little better.
So you want to consider everybody's utility, right? Consumers, producers,
Right.
corporate. Everybody's interests are functionally equivalent, right? One person is one person. They get one vote. They have a certain amount of utility, right? When Deepwater Horizon, wipes out, for instance, the shrimp fishing industry, there's a measurable amount of harm, right? Those fishermen and their consumers are impacted by a certain dollar value.
All the way down the line.
All the way down the line. And we can measure those dollar values. And by using a system of torts, we can create a price, right, that incentivizes activities in concert with the amount of benefits or costs we're creating, right? And by using a regulatory system, we can either go much too far and impose costs that are substantially higher than the costs of the activity, or that reduces costs functionally, as the EPA's role in offshore drilling was and probably still is, and functionally socialize the costs, right?
I'm a little slow, so.
Okay, so if you're taking
Because I don't
on-
understand, because to me, you still haven't answered the question, so I'm trying to figure out, what did the EPA do that helped cause that spill? And why is not BP liable for that? Or
Sure. So the EPA set up a system of regulations.
And BP followed every single one of those regulations down the line?
I don't know if they did. I believe they did not.
Okay.
However,
But if you do, then you're
Hold on,
basically
hold on,
not
no,
liable,
let
I
him
need to
right?
hear,
Well,
I want to hear
Let him
this.
go.
the fine, there are fines for not maintaining those standards, right? For not being in compliance. And your actual price, the price that a corporation would have to consider when they're making these decisions, is the likelihood of being caught, times the price, right? The expected value of being compliant or not. And if you are compliant, then you have a certain price, and there's a certain percentage that there might be a problem.
And who determines these levels of fines or compliance or whatever? Who determines that?
So strangely, in the U.S., where you think of legislation as something that's done by a legislature like Congress or like state legislatures, you actually don't see that at all. Regulatory agencies in the U.S. Have basically been granted the power by Congress to set these things all by themselves. Congress has outsourced their would be a nice way to put it, their responsibility to legislate, and unelected bureaucrats functionally come up with prices. Nominally, they should be hiring economists, to make economic decisions, but if they were, those economists would be telling them that prices should be in line with markets, and clearly they're not, right? So when BP is not compliant, they're responsible for the fine, right? But when BP is compliant, they're responsible for nothing. In either case, they're not responsible for the proper price, which is the amount of harm that they're likely to cause, right? So just by eliminating the EPA, by privatizing whatever we can, certainly not the oceans, where I think certain common resources like the air and the ocean require some kind of oversight, although I think the government does a very bad job at it. I think basically we should use a system of torts that's based on an economic, on fairly simple economic principles, so that we can come up with the right price for the right.
But what caused the oil spill, and why is BP, you don't feel that they're responsible for it?
Well, the government said they're not responsible for it, right? Or they're only responsible for a certain proportion of it. In fact, they were held responsible for a certain proportion. But insofar as they're compliant, they're not responsible. And insofar as they're out of compliance, they're responsible for certain fines. So any corporation, at least any mega corporation, has to make decisions based on the bottom line. And the government has created a system of incentives where they're not really, their decision-making process is not to minimize harm and maximize benefits, right? And I think that's, in either direction, I think it's a problem.
I agree with that.
Right. So I think BP made a conscious decision to maximize their profits, as any company that's going to be successful in the long term does, and that meant being in compliance within the likelihood of being caught, right? And the result is that they were much less safe than they could have been or would have been, and they did more harm, I think, than you would expect. I think if we had torts dictating ecological protection.
So
That makes a
basically,
lot more sense.
yeah, so basically, every company or corporation that does business is basically taking a gamble. Are my return on my investment greater than the fines that I would get if I'm not in compliance with some regulation or whatever?
Right.
And the best example that I can use of that is the one that pops into my head because of recent events was, I'm going to start a university, and I'm going to get all these people to come and I'm going to teach them about broadcasting. Okay? Now, I've made $150 million doing that, but it turns out everybody that came through that door, I defrauded. My university was a fraud. I go to court, I've been found guilty, and it cost me $25 million in fines. So, okay, cool, I don't care. I just made $125 million profit by cheating people.
Right. Exactly. So
And that's basically what's happening in our country.
yeah, absolutely. So the problem here again is one of either regulation or a problem with the tort system, right? Because it's a question of prices, right? So fraud is a tort, right? Fraud is a tort, and when you defraud consumers, you're doing a certain dollar value of harm again, right? And the job of the courts should be to identify what that dollar value is, and along with some punitive amount to, because it's willful, to make it not profitable to do that action, right? Because it's harmful. What we have instead is a system of statutes that say this is what you can do and this is what you can't do, if you're lucky, or regulations made by unelected bureaucrats saying.
And where do these unelected bureaucrats come from?
Regulatory agencies such as the EPA, the
And
Consumer
that's what I'm
Protection.
saying. Where do the EPA people come from? The people
they're-
who work at EPA.
They're appointed by the executive branch in most cases, sometimes with
Interesting.
congressional oversight, not always.
So basically, they may not be or they are a quasi-government agency.
Well, they're a full government agency.
Okay, but I'm just saying some of the regulatory agencies that you say were not legislative bodies, but are still making regulations
Right.
that affect the average person
Absolutely.
and companies,
Correct.
are still hand-picked by legislators
Well, in most
or the
cases.
executive branch.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what it really comes down to is corruption.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, right? I think the role of corruption is kind of confusing, right? Because in order for us to get this right, we don't just have to be honest, right? We have to be honest, and we also have to be right, right? A lot of times, people with good intentions are the ones supporting the people who are corrupt, right?
Right.
I think Donald Trump is very obviously corrupt, but I also think many of his supporters don't realize that. Right, which is bizarre. I mean,
They don't realize it, or they
he's more-
choose to ignore it.
Sure, in either case.
A little.
I think it's a little bit of both.
But
I agree with you, and that's a very interesting a point that you're bringing up, because I think there's a lot of people, when you start talking about corruption, a lot of people point at a lot of people as being corrupt, but I don't necessarily think that all of them are corrupt.
no, and I agree.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are. We have a lot of bureaucrats. I'll give you an example. Off the top of my head, Herman Cain.
Yeah,
I just think he has no fucking clue what he's doing.
and he doesn't.
Now he may be corrupt.
You know why? Because it's not brain surgery.
Right, exactly. But I don't. Where I haven't seen him do anything that I necessarily think is just out and out, flat out corruption. I do think he's done a lot of things that are really stupid and
Right.
in error and against policy or whatever, because he didn't know. And of course, obviously, one of the reasons he didn't know is because he's an incompetent guy that's put in a position where he shouldn't be.
Right.
But I'm just saying that corruption, when you start talking about corruption, you're talking like, to me, that's serious.
No.
Right,
And that's kind of what we were talking about before the show a little bit.
Right.
Like
But
you and I,
like
and
Jason said, like it doesn't in that particular situation, it doesn't matter.
Right,
Even if
right.
even when you're presented with everything his supporters still
Right, they don't
believe
care.
in like mandate of heaven.
But you bring up something
it
else
doesn't matter.
that kind of bothered me too, because while I think that government can really screw up something and make it a whole lot worse, I'm also a little worried about privatization too, because privatization, when you start talking about that, now you're talking about capitalism. And one of the biggest issues with this country right now is that as much as I love capitalism, extreme capitalism is running rampant right now.
Look at
So-
private prisons.
Like, yeah, so
Well, private prisons aren't capitalist, right? Or at least not capitalist in like a laissez-faire traditional sense, right? In order for something to be private, it can't be in the government sector, right? Private prisons have
Right.
one customer, and that customer is the government, right? So obviously,
No. That customer is criminals.
well, criminals aren't the ones who are
No.
paying them.
Well, no,
Criminal-
you're right. Well,
criminals
yeah, they are.
Criminals are actually
Yeah,
the
they are.
product.
They're the product.
Yeah.
Criminals are the product,
Right,
right?
you're
The
right,
government,
you're right.
the government is the customer, which is why private prisons
The ju-
try to create
the
so many
judicial system.
prisoners. Right. So when I'm talking about privatization, I'm not talking about a system of, special pleading and government, government cronies or friends of government that are getting all the benefits, and that's what we've really seen. And I don't really know if I want to
I
call
mean, like
that
charter schools.
to an extent.
it's getting there.
But beyond charter schools, I think in almost every industry, certainly in the industries that we talk about in politics, things like energy, healthcare, education, wherever we have supposedly private industry, it's really dependent on government intervention, healthcare in particular. And the further an industry is from being a supposedly private industry is from being controlled by the government, the more it works in consumer interest, and the more their actions are kind of in line with, I think,
I would say
an
more it
optimal.
should be.
Well, I think we have a lot of empirical evidence about this, right? What would you consider the most heavily regulated sectors in the American economy, right? Not including full-blown government sectors like defense, which I think is very obviously going badly. But I think if you look at sectors like healthcare, like education, like housing, like energy, those are the sectors we're seeing the biggest problems, right? And if you look at the least heavily regulated sectors, consumer goods, electronics, things like that, that's where you're seeing prices come down, you're seeing innovation, you're seeing consumers and, you're seeing both consumers and producers benefit, in a way that's really carrying not just this country, but insofar as we have seen over the past, couple of centuries, a lot of progress in the human condition. I think it's because we've seen a lot of sectors that have been left alone by the government and government agencies that wouldn't have been necessarily
to
in
a
the
certain
past.
point, because like when you talk about electronics, yes, you're right, but now look at how much trouble Apple's just gotten in recently because of monopolies and stuff like that. And
Right, but if we were having
So-
this discussion 10 years ago, we would be saying that Microsoft is the monopolizer.
Right,
Right.
right.
So I think we've seen that that's not the case.
And
Government,
why are they not today?
because we had a system where other firms were allowed to compete. Right. So I think there's an idea in antitrust that fortunately for the past 40 years of American policy kind of started to die out in the 1970s, that having a lot of market share meant that you were some kind of anti-market monopolizer and that the government should step in and intervene. Fortunately, in the 70s, we stopped thinking about antitrust that way. And for a long time, we had a system, we had a fairly dynamic economy from the perspective of monopolization, right? Before we thought of antitrust in what I would consider a more progressive way, where it's not about market share, but it's about anti-market activities, right? We had 3 airlines in this country: Pan Am, TWA, and what's the third one? I don't remember.
United,
United, was it?
American,
whoever it
Yeah.
was.
American Airlines.
And since we've deregulated the airline industry, and since we've stopped thinking about antitrust as a product of market share, we've actually seen much more competition, right? There are, dozens more airlines now than there were then. Prices have come far, far down even if you don't adjust for inflation, right? And we're talking about inflation since the late 70s, which is significant, right? So prices adjusted for inflation have come far down, and the average American has much more access to air travel than they ever have before.
And that's true. Unfortunately, they just don't have the money to pay for it anymore.
Sure,
Because
right?
wages
That's
have
another
not. Yeah.
discussion. Another discussion.
Well, it's a related
And
discussion,
that's the
right?
problem. There's so much we can.
Right.
I think it's all part of the same thing, right? Insofar as we've seen this deregulation, as we have in beer in the brewing industry, as we have in telecommunications from the old Ma Bell days, as we have in air travel, where we've seen deregulation, we've seen a lot of progress for consumers and for America and for the people really globally. And where we haven't seen that, or where we've seen the reverse, we've really seen the opposite, right? So if you look at, the biggest example from the past, decade or so, just over, obviously the housing collapse is like this big example of what people refer to as a failure of capitalism, right, or a failure of markets. But I think it's very clear that happened because of government intervention in the housing market, right? And the government's stated policy since World War II has been to get people into homes, to drive up the price of housing, so that housing is always like a protected investment, right? And the result is that you have an overinvestment, a focus on this sector of the economy. People are building more houses than they need. People are building bigger houses than they need. And people are getting very, very wealthy on paper, right? And then at some point, people who believe that they're millionaires or multimillionaires, they can afford all of this consumption and have all of these empty houses, want to trade that paper wealth for the things they actually want to consume, right? And when they try to do that, they find out those things haven't been produced, right? Because the price of housing has been artificially increased by the government, and it's not only through things like government guarantees for home loans, right? But also artificially low interest rates, right? And government policy in the housing industry in general has been to prop up the price of housing. And when you saw the recession, rather than let the price of housing fall, rather than let the people who made bad loans, the banks, rather than have them eat those losses and learn maybe this isn't the most socially optimal way to run this industry, you have the government step in and say we're gonna socialize these losses, right? We're gonna bail out the banks. We're gonna buy all these bad mortgages, and the result is contagion, right? The result is that you had the negative effects of the recession dispersed over the population.
I agree with you to a certain point. I do think that the government had a large hand in it, but I also think it was because of the banking industry and the housing industry that used the government because they saw that the government was not doing what they were supposed to be doing. They just played the game.
Yeah, well,
when you have somebody
it blew
that's
up in
making,
everybody's face.
of
when
course.
you have somebody that's making $14 an hour with the ability to buy a $300,000 home, something's wrong there.
That ain't government.
No, that is government though, right? I mean, it's a bad loan, right? That person's unlikely to pay it back.
That's correct.
Right, but the banks are issuing it anyway. Why? There's only one reason, and the reason is the government is guaranteeing the loan, right?
Not in all cases.
Right. Bad government policy.
Right.
But that's what I'm saying.
Right.
The banks knew that and took advantage of it.
Right.
So, I mean, if you want to blame somebody, you can say, yeah, the government screwed up and they made some really stupid policies. They shouldn't have gotten involved in it and a lot of that stuff in the first place. But the banking industry knew it and took advantage of it. That's where shit went wrong.
But if I asked you to loan Jason some money, and if he doesn't give it back to you, I will. Don't worry about it. Why wouldn't you?
And also consider, even if I'm not making the argument that the banking industry is blameless or somehow benevolent. I don't think they're any more blameless or any more benevolent than anyone else. But hypothetically, if you were a banker who had the same who believed that the government's interest in getting people into homes was a good one, right? In propping up home prices was a good one. You think you're doing a good thing for the same reason the government does when you're issuing these bad loans. If this guy can't pay, the government will bail him out and we'll have another house to give to another guy.
I understand.
Now, I don't think that's always the case. I don't think bankers are any different than anybody else. A lot of them are badly motivated. A lot of them are not particularly concerned with these things. A lot of them are only looking at the bottom line. But in any case, the solution is the same, right? The solution is for us to coordinate prices with productivity and consumption, right? And if we do that,
I agree with you.
right? And if we do that, I think we see the best outcomes.
Okay, so let me ask you this. This is your ideal situation, and I don't know if you can simplify this enough or not, but in the ideal situation, the ideal world that we would live in, what is the government's role?
So I think
Give me just some examples of the things that they should be handling.
Sure. So I think the government's role should be to correct for market failures, right? I think there are areas where markets can't necessarily price for certain goods or services. I think the most obvious examples, obviously, are defense, police, and courts. Now,
I'm sorry, defense what?
defense, security or police,
Gotcha,
and
okay.
courts.
And
Those are the
courts,
three.
okay.
Those are the three most common examples, and the reason is that they're this is kind of an economic term, but they're considered public goods, which is to say, they're non-rival and they're non-excludable. So if you provide, for instance, as a corporation, security or defense to one person, it kind of creates an umbrella effect for other people, and if you purchase defense or security, it makes it it's has kind of the same problem, right? So the market has difficulty pricing public goods. Now, I think public goods are fairly rare. I think security may or may not be a public good. I think defense certainly is, and I think torts almost certainly are, and we should have a court system, to enforce those policies. Beyond that, I think market failures are relatively uncommon, but I'm sure they exist. And the best way to find them is to make evidence-based policy, right? To start from a position where we say we're going to judge the effects of a regulation on the basis of how much good or harm they do. And the way to do that is to get the government out of the way, find out what happens, and when we see externalities that we can't price, we can step in and price them. But that's not the way government works so far, unfortunately, right? Now, I think one example of a market failure beyond security, defense, and courts is probably land, which is not really a widely held libertarian view. But there are good reasons to believe that there's a market failure for land. And I think we can address that market failure through a land value tax. And I think if we were to address that failure through a land value tax, we can fund security, defense, and courts without creating all of these problems, right? We can do it in a way that corrects markets instead of in a way that distorts markets.
So where does the Libertarian Party, and since you're here, you are speaking for the Libertarian Party.
Why is Libertarian Party quoted?
Oh, because it's...
No, he was saying he was
Because
speaking for.
Because
Right.
he's speaking
Oh,
for
okay.
them.
I'm like, it's a
Yeah,
real
no.
thing, Betty.
No, I know it's a real thing. I know, they cost us the last election. So.
I don't know about that.
Okay, so I want to talk about climate change a little bit. And you all have probably seen this clip that's been going around Facebook, but I want to show it anyway. So we're going to take here just about a minute. We're going to show this clip by, y'all know who Bill Nye the Science Guy is?
Oy vey.
You know who he is, right?
I do.
Okay, because your mom told you about him, or
My mom.
that was a you're not very old joke.
Oh,
That was
thanks.
a compliment. so.
Okay.
All right, so we're gonna show this clip of Bill Nye talking about climate change. So here we go.
Here, I've got an experiment for you. Safety glasses on. By the end of this century, if emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fucking fire. There are a lot of things we could do to put it out. Are any of them free? No, of course not. Nothing's free, you idiots. Grow the fuck up. You're not children anymore. I didn't mind explaining photosynthesis to you when you were 12, but you're adults now, and this is an actual crisis. Got it? Safety glasses off, motherfuckers.
Okay, now we've all seen this clip. What do you think?
So in the first place,
What is the Libertarian Party's stance on
Bill
climate
Nye.
change?
well, so I mean, climate change So the Libertarian Party has a stance, obviously, on environmental protection, more so than it has a specific stance on climate change. And I think the party's stance is that the government is doing a very bad job of solving a very real problem, right? And I think Bill Nye, incidentally, I happen to like Bill Nye for a very specific reason. I think he's a smart guy, which I don't think you can tell either from his background as an engineer or a scientist or his, whatever his scientific or engineering training is. There are plenty of people with degrees who are not the brightest minds in the world.
Exactly, and plenty of people without degrees who know a lot
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons, or the reason really, that I think Bill Nye is a fairly sharp guy is that he was able to change his position on an issue on the basis of the evidence, which was GMOs. And I think that's really what I'm looking for when I'm looking for somebody who's intelligent, somebody who's able to do that. And Bill Nye was.
Say, holy crap, I was wrong.
Right. And I think his perspective on climate change is what we would call in economics, not that I'm speaking for the entire economic field, but an economic term would be a corner solution, right? So he has correctly identified, I think the evidence is very, very clear for this, that the globe is warming thanks, at least in part and probably mostly, due to human actions, right? And I think that's obviously true, and I think he's making a mistake of assuming that that means the solution is for the government to step in and somehow fix it, right? And not only is that not what we're seeing, but I think it's also very clear that the government is the leading driver of climate change, right? And I think that the government's efforts to mitigate climate change will do much more harm than good.
Okay, and you're talking about American government, or you're talking about
I'm talking about governments in general.
In the world.
Well, the American government is the largest single carbon emitter in the world.
Right.
But yes, governments in general are doing more harm than good on this issue.
So,
In what way?
Well, the first and most obvious way is that they have regulated nuclear power out of existence. Nuclear power is carbon neutral. It's not even carbon neutral. Nuclear power doesn't emit carbon. It's carbon zero, right? And nuclear power, I think, is the most obvious and most immediate solution to carbon emissions, right? Because it can provide the power that we need to sustain our standard of living without making energy super expensive and driving us back to the Stone Age. Right. So I think that's the first and most obvious way.
But do you think that we possess currently the technology to do that safely enough?
Yeah, I think the evidence is very clear that nuclear power is not only safe, but much safer than both fossil fuels and most other traditional renewables, things like solar and wind power.
There's actually other countries that have nuclear power plants, and they've been operating safely for them.
And if you look
and Fukushima and Chernobyl and all that, they are the exception, not the rule.
And if you look at those exceptions, the three most obvious or the three most famous exceptions, of course, are 3 Mile Island,
Right.
Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And in the case of 3 Mile Island, nobody was killed. In the case of Fukushima, nobody was necessarily killed, although there's some dispute, but certainly very, very few. And in the case of Chernobyl, almost everybody who was killed because of Soviet incompetence and insanity, right? And that was really more of an engineering issue.
But that was initially, and you also have to look at the long-term effects of Fukushima specifically.
Sure.
And
what
what
I think
that's doing to the sea life.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is there's the sign. I think the idea that nuclear power, including in Fukushima, has the potential to do this extreme long-term harm is the kind of science denial you see from the right on the idea of climate change at all, right? So if you take Fukushima raised the amount of radioactive material in the Pacific Ocean by an infinitesimal amount, right? There's orders and orders of magnitude more uranium floating around the Pacific Ocean than anything that was added by Fukushima.
Says who?
It's people much smarter than me. Right?
No, I'm just asking.
I don't remember exactly the source.
Not that I'm disputing what you're saying, but it's like it depends on who you listen to.
Does it? I'm actually not sure. There is another. I mean, if there is somebody who's disputing that, I would be interested to hear it. I don't think that's a controversial point.
I'm trying to make sure that and I'm as guilty as anybody. I try to, of all the people that I know that do fact checking and do their homework and make sure they're right, this one, So if
Absolutely.
she says something, I believe it because I know she's done her homework and I know that she's gone through that. So everybody else is full of shit as far as I'm concerned.
I'm looking at her face.
Absolutely.
She's so
I mean-
shocked that he's complimenting her. It's like, he said that?
I'm sure our
got it
viewers are
on.
Googling right now.
Yeah.
Uranium and seawater.
Right. No, and I'm not saying that you're
Get a
wrong
clip of
because
that.
I do think that you are correct. But I'm just saying I just want to make sure that we try to make sure that if we're talking about something and somebody checks on it, they're going to find out that we're at least
Yeah,
pretty right. We may not be 100% right, but we're pretty damn close.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but to me, that's an indirect way in how the government is screwing up climate change. To me, that's almost like you reach down and you take a piece off of Monopoly board. Yeah, you kind of messed up the game a little bit because you got a couple things
Gotta
going,
work
but,
around it.
Yeah,
but you can
but-
still work around
Right.
it.
But-
I want to
so
know.
I
how-
don't know if I misunderstood or misheard you. It sounded like you said that the things that our government is doing to try to correct this is actually causing more harm than good.
Absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of other examples. I mean, obviously indirect, sure, I guess in the sense that, well, I don't really know what sense it's indirect, but in the same sense,
Sorry, are we not using nuclear energy because the government thinks that that's bad for the environment?
well, I don't know if the government has thoughts. We're not using nuclear energy because there's kind of a feedback loop between the civilian population and the government that's
Right,
indicated
so
that
it
nuclear
freaks
power
us out,
is
so-
dangerous and scary, right?
Which, when you think about it, is actually funny because one of the reasons why, I don't know if you remember this, a few years back, we had one of our aircraft carriers that went to a place where they had some kind of an issue, a humanitarian issue, and people were saying, well, I can't believe the United States sent
nuclear
an
powered
aircraft
sub.
carrier.
nuclear
The
powered.
reason we sent them is because they're nuclear powered and we can supply energy to everybody in this area. So
Yeah.
we obviously can do this, and we can obviously do it safely, and we've been doing it for decades with no problem. So to me, it's hilarious that these politicians get so scared that something might cause a problem with the population instead of explaining to them, this is why we do what we do. Because I agree
So
with you
what's
about nuclear
another
power. I think it's
example
stupid for them to get rid of it.
Absolutely. So
something
if
that
you
we've
look at
done
the
to-
government's direct efforts to combat climate change, it's mostly in two forms. The first form is regulations to reduce emissions, at least on paper. And the second form is subsidies for alternative energy. And in both cases, I think it's very clear that the result is either increased emissions or increased prices for energy and for consumer goods and services in excess of the supposed benefit.
So by subsidizing the solar industry, the government is actually creating more pollution. Is that what you're saying?
Well, by subsidizing the solar industry, the government has made it difficult for the solar industry to be competitive on price with, for instance, fossil fuels, or even to be innovative.
didn't
right?
seem to bother the gasoline or the petroleum industry.
Well,
I
in
mean,
the
the subsidies that they receive, they
yeah,
seem
exactly.
to be doing pretty damn well.
I was going to point out that we're also subsidizing fossil fuels,
Right.
but pushing that aside for the moment, because I don't believe it's a policy the government does because of climate change, although it's very obviously
Right.
a bad policy
Yeah.
that contributes to climate
Right.
change. I mean, I think eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels is maybe the very first thing you would do if you were concerned about climate change. And since it's not the very first thing, along with eliminating the regulations on nuclear power, that the political left advocates for,
It all comes down to this.
right, I
The
sometimes
money. That's all.
think that their
that's
agenda
everything.
is something other than mitigating climate change. However, the specific subsidies for solar, wind, renewables, and a perfect example is Tesla, right? Electric car companies. The primary role is to make the main product or the main revenue source, the main industry really, for those companies to be government subsidies rather than to be competitive energy, right? So imagine you're a solar startup and you have to compete with Solar City or with Tesla or with any of the other Solyndra, any of the other established solar firms that are getting billions of dollars of government subsidies, right? Let's say your product is better in every way. You can produce it more cheaply and generate more power using less land mass, right? But you can't compete unless you can do that by a wide enough margin that you can outprice the government's subsidies. And that's very, very difficult, and we've seen that it doesn't really happen. In the case of electric cars, if you don't get a grant from the government and you're trying to compete with Tesla, say, for instance, because you have a better technology, you need to be able to produce a comparable car for something like, I think the number was 17,000 fewer dollars. Right, and that's not a realistic barrier.
But that's true in any industry.
Right, I don't think the government should be regulating these industries in general.
But that's what I'm saying is that if you want the capital system or the free enterprise system to be, basically this little outfit here, we compete with HBO, we compete with NBC, ABC, all of that, and there's thousands and millions of us like that. We are still providing a service, and I don't get any kind of subsidies from the government other than my Social Security and my VA disability. But
sure, I mean, in the first place, I wouldn't argue that markets are completely perfect.
Right.
Right. But I would say without the government subsidies, you have a much more level playing field, and you have a system.
No. Elon Musk, there's no fucking way you're going to compete with him and the money that he has. I don't give a shit, whether he gets subsidies or not.
Elon Musk said yesterday, I think it was, that Tesla is 10 months away from being insolvent, right? And that's despite the fact that Tesla's primary revenue source is government subsidies. Sure, but you don't need to have more capital to be competitive, right? I mean, if you look at
because if you don't have the capital to get started and to continue to keep yourself in business for some period of time, you will never get to a place where you will be competitive.
Well,
because all of that shit, anybody who starts a business,
everybody
who starts a business, that money comes out of their pocket.
Right.
Yeah.
So they get going.
Well,
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Walmart,
if I've
And
got
if they
deep
have
pockets,
if they have a really good product, then they're eventually going to.
right.
there's a lot of really good products out there that never make it to the market.
But
Walmart-
the reason why they're not making it is because some of the larger businesses are sabotaging them, so they won't grow, or they're trying to buy them
Of
out
course.
so
But-
they can have a
course.
monopoly.
But I don't think that's what we see at all, right? I mean, there is an extent, certainly more recently, where that's the case. But Walmart started as a 5 and dime store in what is it, Bentonville, Arkansas, or something like that. Amazon, Microsoft, Apple. These are all companies that basically kids started in their parents' garages, right?
But that's 20, 30, 40 years ago. That
Well,
is
what
not
changed? Why isn't-
possible in our country today?
I largely agree, and I think not only the primary reason, I think the only reason we've seen that change, and especially that we've seen it change so dramatically, is because the government, especially since the recession, but in part of a trend that started before that, has taken a larger and larger role in capital allocation.
So it's not. Let me see if this is correct. It's not the size of the government that you're concerned about. It's the quality of the government.
Well,
Because you can have the biggest government in the world, but if it's working for everybody and it's giving us health care and it's giving us education that we're not paying through the nose for, is that a bad thing?
No, that would be great. The problem is, so I'm not a libertarian because my value system is that reducing the government to as small a size as possible
Right, no,
is
I
inherently the
didn't
best thing in
mean
the
it that
world,
way,
right?
but
I'm a libertarian because I think the system of putting the government in charge is inherently broken, right? I think the government is not
that's
capable.
It. So it's not that you have anything against the government. It's you, and I'm talking about you personally now.
Right.
You just think that what we've got ain't working and we need to fix it.
Absolutely.
Okay, and you believe that you have the right tools to fix that. And when I say you, I'm talking about the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, I think more broadly you can say that people as participants in markets have the right tools, right?
Okay.
It's not that I don't think we should
So
have any planning.
We're
It's
really
that I don't
starting
think-
to run out of time here. I mean, and you can come back any time, believe me.
For sure. I'd be happy
You guys have
to.
anything that you want to? Because I have one question
I
to
will
ask you
say
before
that,
we finish.
I really think that getting the government out of a lot of this stuff, you could probably make a really good start by getting rid of corporations out of government.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Money in
I think I think it's kind of one and the same, right? One of the big hurdles the Libertarian Party faces is that we don't have any corporate contributors, and it's not because we wouldn't take the money. Believe me, we would. Certainly, if I had any say over it, I'd be the first to. The problem is, as libertarians, we actually don't have much to offer corporations, right? We want to deregulate. That's not what corporations want, right? So they're not going to give us money so that we can allow people to compete on a level playing field. That's not what they want to see at all.
So one of the reasons why governments are so busy regulating all this stuff is because corporations want them to do it because they get a benefit out of it.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Anything, kiddo? Any final words?
Am I about to be executed?
No,
I don't think so.
She's still
You're coming back
shocked
next
because you
week.
gave her a compliment.
I know.
She's still dealing with it.
Speechless.
Drink Harris.
Drew Carey?
Whatever.
Trick Harris, I don't think you must have missed the episode.
Oh no, I didn't.
They were good last words.
Yes. No, but I actually, I've had some comments about you coming on today, and I'm curious what's the biggest thing that you disagree with as far as most of the libertarians that you know? What would most of them yell at you about?
I mean, libertarians are a fairly diverse bunch. I think a land value tax is a big area of disagreement with probably the majority or certainly plurality of the Libertarian Party. Let me think. I have mixed feelings about UBI, but I basically support it. I certainly support it as an intermediary step. I think that's an area of disagreement. I mean, there's a lot of crazy libertarians out there. So.
No.
I think a big example.
We all have our crazies.
Shocked.
Absolutely. Well, I think a big example of my disagreement with libertarians is not so much a disagreement on the ideas of libertarianism as it is on the priorities. I think right now the Libertarian Party should drop most of its advocacy and be a single issue immigration advocacy organization, because I think right now we're facing a situation where immigration is just the most important issue facing a lot of innocent people who are suffering for no good reason, and I think
That are beneficial to our country.
absolutely.
And
I think it's a very clear-cut issue
Yeah.
as well, and I think the Libertarian Party does itself a disservice by saying, well, we support open borders or more open borders certainly than we have now, but our priority, of course, is this other
And
these
I
other
don't know
hills
anybody
to die
that
on.
advocates open borders.
Well,
I
I
mean,
do.
You do. So there should
Absolutely.
just be no restrictions. Anybody can come and go across the border.
Speaking of that, I guess I
absolutely.
do have I did want to read this.
Please do. Please do.
This Facebook comment on somebody shared a news article about the new abortion laws, and some mental giant named Robert Adams says, "Now maybe God can stop sending us illegal Mexicans as judgment on our country. We abort 50 million human beings. God sends us 30 million Mexicans who hate our freedoms and who will not assimilate." Robert, kiss my ass.
I can't even get mad about that. That's just stupid.
Okay, so
You're gonna keep punishing me
we
with
got to wrap this up.
Mexicans. I
But
love my
Jason, I
Mexicans.
have a question for you. That this is probably going to be the toughest question that you have to ask or that you have to answer when it comes to politics. And I'm dead serious. I'm not trying to. I don't want to be a jerk. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. But and this is based on some of the things that I've read that may or may not be true. I think they're true. The sources say that they're true. But anyway, so if you had to choose that your vote could guarantee whether or not our current president gets reelected. In other words, if you vote strictly libertarian, you know that he's probably going to get reelected. Would you vote, or would you still vote libertarian?
Yeah, that's actually a very easy question for
Okay.
me. In 2016, if I thought my vote could have changed the outcome of the election from Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, I would have voted Democratic.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, that's not the case. my state was carried by Hillary Clinton. There are only a couple of swing states.
I think there was 4.
Well, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida,
Wisconsin.
and in 2016, Wisconsin and Michigan.
Right.
But that's unusual, mostly because,
Right.
well, for reasons. But yeah, I mean, if I lived in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Florida, because of the kind of unique threat that I think Donald Trump poses to our country, I probably would have voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, except that I didn't think Trump was such
Okay,
a
so I'm going to stop you there
threat to
because
win.
my respect for you has just gone way up. That
No, I
because
think
one
you
of
were a great guest.
no, yeah, but
I still have no
my
respect for
pet peeve has always been people who vote the party line just because it's the fucking party line, and I have most always been registered as nonpartisan, not independent, not anything else, but nonpartisan, because sometimes these people have it right, sometimes these people do, and I do not want to get locked into, well, I'm a Democrat, so I have to vote for the Democrat. I'm a Republican, so I have to vote for the Republican. I'm a Libertarian, so I have to vote for the Libertarian. I try to vote for what the fuck is best for our country.
Absolutely,
Good
but
for you.
And I'm glad that I that was
for sure.
that was the best answer I could have hoped for.
Absolutely. On that note, though, I think 2016 is kind of an unusual election, and I think part of the reason we
No
ended
shit.
up right. I think part of the reason we ended up we're in a situation where we had such horrible alternatives is that for so long we have had this two-party system where people were afraid for if I don't vote for my guy, the other guy's going to win. So I got to vote for even as horrible as he is, Donald Trump, because I'm afraid, I don't know, Hillary's Benghazi or emails or something, whatever the fear is, right? I think we ended up in a situation where people were looking less and less at the the quality of their candidates.
In a lot of ways, it was a perfect storm.
Absolutely.
2016 was a perfect
Absolutely. And during the 2016 election, when I didn't really think Trump was a threat to win, when people would tell me they were voting out of fear, I would say the reason we got to this point, is that people have always been voting out of fear. They've been voting for the candidate that they think is less harmful, and now we're in a position where
Now
there's
we
a candidate
found
who
what
can do
harmful
real
really is,
damage.
yeah.
And if we keep going along this path, we'll eventually have a president like Trump. We'll eventually have a candidate like Trump get elected, and that is what happened, right?
Yep.
So I think the first thing we have to do is find some kind of return to normalcy, and when we do, I think we have to stop saying, we have to stop treating candidates like Hillary Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. We have to stop treating them as though they're all Donald Trump, because they're not, right? And I think if we had voted for Gary Johnson in 2012 or for the Libertarian Party candidates in prior years, we never would have ended up in this situation. So even though the Libertarian Party can't necessarily win in any given election, that doesn't mean there aren't reasons to vote for us, both because growing in voter share is what allows us to win in future elections, but also because it affects the popular mandate, right? When you're voting for a Libertarian, you're saying this is what I want out of your candidates to Democrats and Republicans, and it pulls us, I think, more in a rational direction.
It has been more and more about the candidate and not the issues.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've lost in the last half a dozen elections.
Yeah.
Is not what are the issues. I mean, there's been exceptions, but for the most part, it's like, well, I like this guy better. Well, what's his policies? Well, I don't know. He's gonna build a wall.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Anyway, sorry. All right, so we got to wrap this up so we can make room for some other people coming in here and want to talk about their shit. So. Gary, excuse me, Jason. Again,
Gary
Thanks for
Johnson,
having me.
thanks for showing up.
Thank you very much, and you're welcome here anytime. And please spread the word. We cater to all types here.
Absolutely. Thank you
We're
for having
tolerant.
me.
We're tolerant. Guys, Dirk.
I'm good. It was good. Good show.
Okay.
Yep,
Yeah, you too.
I'm happy.
All right, then we're done. Screw you guys. We're out of here.